I once intentionally sabotaged a job interview. I was interviewing at a congregation which at the time was less progressive in the way that a girl could become a bat mitzvah at that shul. And specifically, women didn't carry Torah scrolls, didn't read from Torah scrolls, even in the context of a bat mitzvah. I think if they were open to moving towards the modern wing of modern Orthodoxy on some of those issues, I think I could have guided them in that process and worked with them in that process, were it not for the fact that I was interviewing at that shul just a few months before my own daughter's bat mitzvah. And I knew that were I to be hired at that congregation, just a few months in, we would need to figure out a way to celebrate our daughter's bat mitzvah in the way that she had been raised to expect. And so while I was being interviewed, it was clear to the committee interviewing me that I was coming from a more progressive Orthodox congregation and that it was more religiously diverse, and there was some anxiety about that. And a woman on the committee interviewing me said, but surely you wouldn't push any of these changes quickly. You're just open to a conversation over the long term about all of these issues. And at that moment, I had this clear sense that the answer she wanted me to give was, oh yeah, of course, I'm not pushing any agenda. I just want to guide the synagogue with lots of input playing out over many, many months and perhaps years. But what I said instead was, well, actually, my daughter's bat mitzvah is coming in just a few months. And if I move here, we're going to have a very short amount of time to implement at least some of these changes so that she can celebrate her bat mitzvah in the way that we have always hoped that she would be able to celebrate it.
There was a moment in the interview, I actually didn't see it. My wife was there, and she was standing in the back of the congregation, and a child began to cry, and the parent began to hustle the child out. And another congregant said, no, we want you to stay. We want you to be here. And that was the moment that my wife fell in love with the congregation. For me, it was just talking to people.
A good fit, or expressed more painfully by someone else, it's not a good fit. We all know these words from critical inflection points in our life, whether in the untimely conclusion of an exciting job interview process or at the heartbreaking end of a relationship. They are words that say a lot without saying much at all. The process of discerning a good fit is complicated in most jobs and relationships, but consider the added drama when it comes to hiring a rabbi. After all, a rabbinic job is no ordinary job. A rabbi is expected to not just be a leader of a community that already exists, but a shaper of that very community. The community is hiring someone they expect will not just care for them, but make decisions over the years that dictate how the congregation grows and changes. This is a complicated power dynamic. In a curious codependent relationship that is sometimes hierarchical and sometimes not, how do you assess over the course of a simple weekend whether it's actually going to work? I have a good friend who owns a small business, and he shared with me once his wisdom that any job candidate's interview day is probably going to be their best day. On a rabbinic interview weekend, the rabbi is likely to wheel out their best sermon and probably also their best suit. And the community also is going to be on their best behavior. Even so, as David's opening anecdote illustrated, it's not just about showing your best self, it's also about testing the waters to make sure your expectations of one another are aligned. Ari's story flipped the script a bit. Sometimes it's precisely in the unscripted moments that help rabbis discover whether it's the right congregation for them. In both stories, I was taken by the fact that David and Ari's discernment process revolved around the consequences of the shidduch, the pairing, for their families, maybe even more than for themselves. That's part of a good fit, too. Rabbinic jobs, like academic positions, tend to involve long-term relocations to where the jobs are. It can be hard at the outset of a career to visualize what your whole life is going to look like. And think about the leap of faith involved in making such a momentous decision that defines not just what your workday looks like, but what your whole family's Jewish and personal life will consist of as well. After all, as with any enduring relationship, whether personal or professional, on the first date or on the interview weekend, everyone is on their best behavior. But a lot has to work out, a lot of change and a lot of adaptation for the other person or for the congregation to become the center of your life for the rest of your life, and for them, too, to feel the same way about you. I'm Yehuda Kurtzer, and this is episode 2 of Rabbinic Identities, Rabbinic Crises, a series from Identity Crisis at the Shalom Hartman Institute that explores what it means to be a rabbi, the solitary, the social, and the spiritual.
Our shul in Chicago was located adjacent to the major gay neighborhood in Chicago, and there were a number of gay families and individuals who were really active members of the shul there from the beginning of my time there through to the end. And that was, I had gay friends in college, but they weren't out, at least not to me. And their friendship and they seeing the really passionate commitment they had to orthodoxy and to Torah and mitzvot was really inspiring to me and challenging to me, and is pushing me and has pushed me to change how I think about related issues.
David Wolkenfeld moved with his family to start a new position at Ohev Shalom in Washington, D.C. about a year ago. He came to Ohev after serving for a decade at Anshe Shalom B'nai Israel in Chicago, a decade in a neighborhood that significantly altered his outlook on the rabbinate and on those he was meant to serve. Most of all, though, those years imprinted on him relationships with a particular group of people who he had to leave behind in order to meet this new community to whom he was going to have to become accountable.
Looking around the shul in my final weeks serving in Chicago and seeing 150 people in shul, I knew all of their names. I knew the names of their children. I knew the parents and grandparents who had come to visit for Yamim Tovim. I had been at the funerals of many of their relatives. I had named a lot of the kids in the shul. And so it's a huge amount of institutional memory and connections. And I knew that in a few weeks it would be of very limited professional use to me to hold all those relationships. And then my first weeks in DC, looking around the room and see these are strangers. We felt incredibly welcomed by the community, but these are strangers. They don't know the parents. They don't know the names of their kids. We don't have any history. They don't really have a reason to trust me. And I knew that it would take time to build those relationships.
For Carrie Brown, the transition to a new community brought more than the challenge of meeting new people. It required relocating from the United States to Canada and encountering Jews and expressions of Jewishness that were deeply unfamiliar to her. Don't let the proximity of Canada to America fool you. We're not the same, and our Jewishnesses are different too.
In Canada, Reform Jews are very much the minority. Growing up in the U.S., in the Midwest, I almost didn't know any Orthodox Jews, to be honest. The social policy of Canadian society and the government is so different than what some of the struggles are in the U.S., and it took maybe 5 or so years to kind of pull myself out of that American lens. It was an adjustment. Canadian Jews are different. I found myself over time really appreciating the difference and the distinction of what makes particularly Reform Canadian Jews. I really appreciate the dedication to traditionalism, Yiddishkeit, Am Yisrael, but also modernity. I think some of the things that were harder to learn or that took some adjustment, one of the big ones was actually patrilineal descent. That growing up in the Reform movement, starting my rabbinate in an assumption that someone who is descended patrilineally is a full part of the community. And Canadian Reform, kind of like Israeli Reform movement, does take a more traditional sort of line on that topic.
Every bar and bat mitzvah, before the bar and bat mitzvah, we put on our talit together and I talk about the mitzvot. And I say, Jewish people, we don't think of them as a burden. They're a blessing. They're an embrace of love. And so I am wrapped up in our people and I'm wrapped up in our tradition and our story. And I'm getting to write this little teeny line on the story.
Of course, rabbis are hardly the only individuals who have to acclimate themselves to a new community or who can struggle to figure out what they need from a community and what they have to offer in return. Stephanie and I struggled with belonging to Jewish community early in our marriage. We got married very young and moved to Boston. We were part of the age demographic, which runs from 22 to at least 40, that generally doesn't belong to Jewish communal institutions. But we were observant Jews, and observant Jewish life really can't operate in isolation. We were in transition from our Orthodox upbringings and looking for more egalitarian options, and it was really hard. You can't simply decide to embrace a different ideology and not notice that there are all sorts of cultural and social trappings involved in communities that look different from the ones you came from and are going to feel uncomfortable. It took relocating again to Washington, D.C. for a year, where a new independent minyan was sprouting up, and watching the way that a whole bunch of young people were building something that was taking care of their needs, for us to realize that we had real needs of community as well. It was time to honor them, take them seriously, and find a community that could take care of us as well. That's what we worked on when we moved back to Boston. And we didn't find a community, we founded that community. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging, amidst the sophistication and nuance that we all afford to our Jewish choices, that we human beings have basic anthropological needs for community. Everything else is the trappings around those needs. Rabbis know this. They see it daily in the people that they serve.
Most rabbinic work is behind the scenes, right? People see a drasha, they see a shiur, they see something on the bulletin as on the shul's calendar that the rabbi is doing something and available for something. But the individual meetings are like that person knows. And sometimes I have this sort of selfish feeling, that seemed like it was helpful for that person. I hope they tell their friends. I hope word gets out that I was helpful to them in this moment.
It's a good story when it all works out. When a person or a family needs something like pastoral support, a Hebrew school education for their kids, a social world, a place to say Kaddish, and they know to look for the right congregation, and they know how to discern which kind of congregation is right for them, and they know how to show up, and they know how to belong. Meanwhile, for that to work, you also need a congregation that can readily absorb that person or that family. This means, as Ron Wolfson has written, that everyone who works for the congregation or who volunteers there, and most of the members, have to exhibit a culture of welcoming. There are too many stories of individuals who get turned off right away by what they experience as hostility or just some misunderstanding at a new community, and then their search starts again, or maybe they just give up. And some people have no interest at all in even trying to join a Jewish community due to their preconceived notions that there are no Jewish communities that are representative of their personal expression of Judaism. Our Jewish lives are no longer characterized by the expectation, culturally or otherwise, that we have to belong, as earlier eras of Jews experienced. Now, all of us need the serendipity of a good search for the right rabbi or the right institution, and the experience on the other end of feeling that that rabbi or that institution was searching for you too. Like the Midrash says about good pairings between loving partners, it's a miracle that it can ever work. Shortly after Stephanie and I started our congregation in Boston together with a few friends, in which we were solving for our needs by creating the congregation that we wanted, we noticed something amazing. After the very first Shabbat that the congregation met, when 60 people unexpectedly showed up in response to a single email that we sent to our friends and networks, we heard a similar refrain from a lot of different people, some version of, "I had a hard time being there because everyone else is friends with each other and I felt like an outsider." We were dumbfounded. None of us really knew each other, even those of us that those people saw as the insiders just because we had organized the minyan. I learned a lot from that experience. I learned that the default experience for so many modern Jews is an intrinsic sense of alienation. I don't know if this is about loneliness or about fear. Maybe a little bit of it is a kind of unaware hubris in the belief that in order to belong, you need the system to accommodate itself to you. Rabbis are responsible for this dynamic in their institutions. For over a decade now, more and more rabbis in synagogues, in schools, in JCCs, at Hillels, they've been trying to break down these invisible boundaries between Jews who want community and the institutions that they see as inaccessible or inhospitable to them. One growing answer in the field is to help people understand that they can connect to a community even if they don't step inside the building that houses that community. If once upon a time the synagogue was the place to constitute Jewish communal life, now it might have to be the catalyst to create community even outside its doors. Carrie Brown runs a program through Temple Shalom in Vancouver that brings together and engages young Jewish families on the east side of Vancouver, outside the walls, the real ones and the imagined ones of the congregation.
People really want to be able to do Jewish things, but they really want to meet other Jews. The Jewish institutions of Vancouver are all on one street, on Oak Street, in the middle of the city, but young families cannot afford to live anywhere near Oak Street. And so as people were moving further and further out, but the institutions were not as close by, we realized we really needed to bring the Jewish community out. So we started to do pretty much monthly programs out in the community, mostly cultural, holiday-based programs as well. And it's been remarkable. And a lot of people we know that are looking for meaningful connection and either aren't sure where to look or how to start, or maybe have ideas about what synagogue is that are different from what we represent. So the end goal is to help them find a meaningful connection anywhere. It doesn't have to be our shul.
There are a lot of reasons that many Jews take a while in their adult journeys to join a synagogue if they do at all. Some of those issues are structural, like the perception that these communities constitute closed social circles or the perceived cost of membership. I think most commonly, a lot of Jews don't quite know what they need, and they can't imagine how the rabbi or the synagogue can be of help to them. Chabad, of course, is way ahead on this. As the American Jewish denomination that best understands market capitalism, it takes its agenda to the streets and online and engages in aggressive marketing and sales. But they're not the only ones. I think every rabbi in the business right now is caught between the work of serving their existing population and finding ways to attract others in. Before Joel Nickerson came to Wilshire Boulevard Temple, he worked for Hillel at the University of Pennsylvania, and he ran the Jewish Renaissance Project, a program dedicated to making Jewish learning relevant for students who were peripherally involved in Jewish life on campus and who otherwise had chosen not to affiliate with existing programs or brick-and-mortar Jewish institutions on campus. To do this work of meeting people where they are has to originate with a commitment to Hillel's dictum in the Mishnah. I mean Hillel, the ancient sage, not Hillel, the contemporary Jewish institution, that we're meant to imitate Aaron, loving the people and bringing them closer to Torah. You can't do the latter without a relentless commitment to the former. But to start there means doing something more than just making Judaism interesting. It requires interrogating why those on the outside are on the outside, and then doing user-centered design to engage those people in Jewish life in ways that they're going to find compelling.
One of the great things about the JRP, Jewish Renaissance Project, and the way in which we kind of strategized finding the students who would be great leaders and great participants in our programs was really starting with that individual. And it was almost as though every student I met with, I had to learn their Torah. And I had to be able to interpret their Torah of their Jewish journey and what it is that motivated them, both secularly and Jewishly, what their B'nai Mitzvah experience was like, whether it was good or bad, if they even had one at all, what they were studying, what they cared about, what they were involved with extracurricularly. That became their Torah. And then my job was to figure out, okay, what's an avenue by which they can grow Jewishly based on their Torah, as opposed to, this is the Torah of the institution, this is what we are providing, and you can come in and hopefully you'll find your place within that framework. It just became a much more personalized way of entering into a relationship, investigating someone's desires and needs and where they actually could come into the fold. And then it was about how do you place people who have similar desires together in a cohort, and then you're going to be able to build something really special.
This is a really different way of doing rabbinic work, which is far less about going to an office in a building where community exists, with the role of caring for those on the inside and steadily expanding the circle. Here, community is something that is maybe in the offing. First, you have to create pathways for people in unmarked terrain. That requires taking Torah from out of the community and bringing it to the people.
There has been a pretty significant path towards the synagogue, I think in a lot of ways because of our religious school. We have a very large religious school, and so people, both because the program is good, but also because lots of other Jewish kids are there, they want their kids to meet other Jewish kids, they sign up for the school. I actually remember we've had for a number of years a sukkah that we put at one of the community centers in East Vancouver. It's been this annual tradition for this group that's fantastic. And there was a group of people standing around this. We'd done this for maybe 3 or 4 years. I said, we just joined Temple Shalom. we just joined Temple Shalom. We just joined Temple Shalom. It was like, at first they were all a little bit embarrassed that they joined a synagogue. And then they realized that the people that they like and they've met through this engagement are the same people that they were already friends with. And that was really nice. We just want to help people find their place.
So what is the common denominator for what people are seeking and what rabbis do to make community work? Several rabbis kept shifting our conversation back to the basic hard work that it takes, the tireless and sometimes unseen labor of building and sustaining belonging between people and the community and between people in the community. It's magical when you feel deeply part of a community, but it doesn't happen by itself.
I think serving for these many years has also made me internalize what had been more abstract, that like everything is about relationships and that it doesn't matter how brilliant the shiur is if people don't feel that you care about them.
I do really love when you get to meet people and help them find their place in the community, whether it's just saying like, you should come and spend time with us and, we want to make you feel welcome here in the building, in the community, or finding like a particular role in the community that can really be meaningful to them and also bring their talents into the community.
The culture of the community is one of intimacy, even though we're very large, and that we're founded on relationships, and not just the relationship between the rabbi and the community, but how do I then help facilitate strategies where people feel connected to one another in a very big city.
Our membership chair a few years ago, Jamie Wender, she came to us with the idea that everyone should wear name tags. When you walk in, you get a name tag. And if you're not a member of the congregation, there's all kinds of name tags that describe a little bit about who you might be. Like, I'm a proud grandparent, or shul shopping, or visiting the community. And so every bar and bat mitzvah, like lots of congregations give gifts. And the last gift that I always give is the name tag. And this thing happened when I gave the first name tag, everyone started cheering. And it just like, I didn't know that was going to happen. And it happened every single time. And it caught me off guard the first time. Now it's just sort of the culture of the synagogue. And the thing that I say to every kid is that the most important thing is that you count here, that we want you to be known and we want you to know us. And knowing the name of a person is such a powerful way.
Look, personally, I'm not sure how I'd feel about wearing a name tag every Shabbat, but I get the motivation and I love the message behind it. My favorite activity that I've seen in our community and elsewhere is when the rabbi or the shul president announces a period of name amnesty, where you are hereby permitted to acknowledge that person you regularly sit next to in shul, or who you make small talk with at Kiddush, that you don't know their name, that maybe you never knew it, maybe you just forgot it. In my experience, the announcement of name amnesty helps people giggle a little bit when they admit to one another that they've been faking it for a while, and it takes away all the shame and defensiveness that honestly just gets in the way of relationship building. I mean, after all, do I really have to memorize 300 people's names, or do I just need to feel safe and comfortable around them with just enough familiarity to feel like our praying together and snacking together makes us part of something bigger than ourselves? Carrie reflected on how people need to be seen in order to feel part of something, while Sarah spoke about how when we create resources for people to learn about and to connect to a Judaism that feels abstract, we need to weave those big and inaccessible stories into the intimacy of that which they already understand.
When I came to Vancouver, a large part of our congregation was made up of interfaith families. I don't know the number, maybe 20-25%, but they'd never been acknowledged from the Bima. And I gave a Yom Kippur sermon that in Boston, where I had come from, it would have been like 20 years before. But I felt like we could start to kind of have this conversation, thinking about what our contemporary Jewish community is here and how do we embrace the Jewish people of Vancouver in a way that is meaningful and loving. And so many people came up to me just feeling seen after that drush. And the response made me realize, this was something really, really different that has never been heard here before. But to make change in a congregation is something that rabbis really do have the opportunity to do through leadership, through teaching, through many, many, many conversations.
In a resource created by a colleague at Hayas for Tisha B'Av, in exactly the same way that we're engaging right now with post-October 7th poetry and liturgy, it took the lived experience of people fleeing Kabul and their loss of Kabul and juxtaposed that directly against Lamentations. You want to get Reformed Jews who don't have a deep chush and connection to Lamentations and that sense of loss from 2,000 years ago for an institution that we don't want to reestablish. You want to get people to feel something for that. Then that parallel experience from 3 years ago really brings that text to life and helps people feel it and feel connected to it.
Even as we stretch the boundaries of community to enable more people into community, we're always going to run up against boundaries. Boundaries in one form or another are baked into the idea of community, whether because they constitute the geographic limits that define catchment areas for different synagogues, whether they provide the ideological framework that helps define a community's norms and commitments, or whether they just constitute the limit of what a rabbi, employed by a particular synagogue, can offer to people outside the building. After all, rabbis are not merely working within the confines of the synagogue, they're also responsible for the boundaries of the institution itself. They are gatekeepers of entry and access, and they have to manage boundaries when it comes to allocating the precious resources at their disposal, especially their time. Carrie encountered this limit when it came to enrollment for her Jewish information class, which was meant for people considering conversion to Judaism. Everyone who was going to participate in the class was going to be an outsider, by definition. But could the class actually accommodate everyone?
We have people reaching out to us from really far away. And, it's not that they couldn't access Jewish learning remotely, but they just couldn't access Jewish life living 6 hours away from Vancouver. And we actually came to a decision that we couldn't make that commitment. We couldn't serve them. And it was one of those boundaries that we had to put up. And at the same time as well, we have other courses that are more introductory that anyone can really come to and access. But for the JIC, we really want people who already have some invested connection or interest in the project of the Jewish people before we really dedicate, I don't know how many hundreds of hours a year to really being there as a Mora Derech in this role. So sometimes we tell people, not yet, come for Shabbat for a year.
At B'nai Jeshurun in New York City, the synagogue has been defining and testing the limits of community for a long time. Their rabbis were ordained in different seminaries and different denominations, and the synagogue is officially non-denominational after having disaffiliated from the conservative movement in the 1990s. That decision is being road-tested in other synagogues around the country now as part of American Judaism's evolving past the strict parameters implied by the denominational divisions of Jewish life for the past century, which have less and less currency increasingly for today's Jews. For BJ, that decision meant that they were foregrounding their own theory of community, defined by what they saw as the needs of its members, over the idea of community as a microcosm of a larger sense of communal belonging. Even so, choices like this get tested anyway. If a community can shape its own norms, members of that community are going to want to test the limits at all times. This was on display a few years ago when the BJ clergy confronted the question of performing interfaith marriages. I find this a thrilling example because it's a question of community, namely who gets to be a part of it, nested inside a different question of community, namely how do we define our norms.
So over a number of years, we had conversations with kids. I'm calling them kids because they grew up in the community and then desired for us as their rabbis to marry them, and we were unable. The bylaws of the community said we had to follow the laws and standards of the conservative movement, which prohibited the officiation of rabbis at intermarriages. At some point, it didn't feel sustainable anymore. We saw how much frustration was happening in the community and how much pain also when we met with people who felt so at home in the community and felt so deeply connected to us as rabbis, or their parents felt a lot of loss when we couldn't officiate their children's weddings, it didn't feel comfortable anymore after a while to just say, well, we're not allowed. When we felt actually that we hadn't really thought of the process. And we decided we had to kind of wade into the issue. And actually, we called upon the Hartman Institute to help guide us because we didn't want it to just be an emotional reaction, but really to think through what were the deep issues that were guiding these conversations as the demographics of our community were changing. What we really figured out was that we were more invested in what we called at the time, like the Jewish enterprise, people wanting to build Jewish homes, than actually making a judgment about who people were marrying. And what we were seeing is that many people were coming to us wanting a Jewish ceremony and a Jewish home, but we're getting kind of the stop sign when actually that's what we want. And so we created a commitment that we would only officiate at weddings where we felt strongly that they wanted to build a Jewish home. And we also decided that that would be true for Jewish couples. Now, very few Jewish couples come and say, I don't want to build a Jewish home. But we felt like it was actually a truth that if that was what we were committed to, no matter what the couple was, that should be the driving force around our officiation. So we went through this whole long process. Many people had a lot of feelings about the process. And in the end, despite where people felt disappointed and where we ended on the decision, we had only one person leave the community, and they actually came back. And I think it spoke to the seriousness by which we dealt with the process, both emotionally and intellectually.
The backstory in Felicia's account is that back in 2015, I was approached by several prominent conservative and conservative-adjacent rabbis seeking a space and content to discuss and deliberate the intermarriage question. It's been an evolving issue in the conservative movement, which is caught between the conservatism of Orthodox Judaism on this issue, which prohibits intermarriage strictly, and the progressivism in Reform Judaism, which has become far more accommodating in shifting the terms of Jewish identity and seeking to build a culture of radical inclusivity. At the time, however, it was a hard conversation to have in conservative Jewish circles, and as an illustration of the complexity of ideological community, Hartman was seen as a useful neutral site to constitute a Beit Midrash to study the issues at hand. After our learning together with these rabbis, BJ ultimately changed its policy, as did one or two other congregations that participated. But several rabbis left our learning affirmed in their practice of only officiating at intrafaith weddings, because good Torah, after all, has 70 faces. Intermarriage has been viewed with a particular severity as a boundary marker in Jewish life. The issue of rabbis officiating at intermarriages and whether interfaith families can belong in Jewish community has divided more than one congregation, and I think it still threatens to divide the conservative movement more generally. This should be no surprise. Like I said, the testing of boundaries always tests the structure of a community. But communities are tested and pulled apart in myriad ways, and the role of the rabbi is essential in navigating these tensions, sometimes in making definitive choices, and always trying to make sure that communal controversies do not break a community apart. You remember that old joke? Two feuding congregants come to the rabbi with a dispute, having exhausted their arguments with one another and finding themselves at an impasse. The first congregant passionately pleads his case. The wise rabbi strokes his beard, nodding along. When the congregant finishes, the rabbi concludes, "You're right." Second congregant jumps up and screams, "Rabbi, you haven't heard my side." And he entreats the rabbi with his side of the story, repudiating the account of his interlocutor, rebutting his claims with his evidence. Again, the rabbi nods and strokes his beard. When the man finishes, the rabbi says, "You're right too." In from the kitchen runs the rabbi's wife, enraged, who has been listening all along. "You fool," she shouts to her husband. "How can they both be right?" To which the rabbi responds, "You're also right." As much as I love this joke, I have to tell you, if you're a rabbi and you think that that's your strategy to resolve a difficult, divisive question at the next synagogue board meeting, I think you may quickly find it is no longer the right fit. Ron Hafetz and Marty Linsky describe leadership as disappointing people at a rate that they can absorb. Rabbis sometimes have to do this deliberately, making hard choices that will not satisfy everyone in their community. But even if it's not intentional, everyone in the context of diverse community will be disappointed some of the time.
We had a moment in our Yom Kippur service last year. Our spiritual music innovator, Ori Salzberg, a phenomenal educator, he came to me a few weeks before Yom Kippur, and I tasked him with the Avodah service. Like, I want you to make the Avodah service as beautiful as you can make it. And he said, I think this is going to be better with an instrument. And we don't have a custom of having musical instruments in our sanctuary on Shabbat. And so I went to the president and the religious life chair and the board, and all of them agreed to this idea. And I called congregants, but I didn't call enough. And after that moment, there were people who came up to me immediately it was the most profound moment of their prayer in their whole history at Shearith Israel. And they were quick to tell me. But the ones the days after said that was the hardest moment. It broke something in me. I had to walk out. I couldn't be in my service. And the tension of, I want Avodah to be real for folks. I want Avodah to move their hearts. I want them to feel that God is present with them and that they are forgiven for all of the things that we do wrong every year. And it turns out that maybe I could have done that better because the folks who I miss, who I might have broken something for in that choice, it is a point of sadness within me. And I still want to elevate the experience for everyone and the recognition that it can't be for everyone, but that a community holds boundaries that just can't be reconciled sometimes.
10 years ago, there was a partnership minyan. A partnership minyan is sort of like a form of worship that is maybe in between Orthodoxy and conservative Judaism. Women receive aliyot and read the Torah alongside men, but only men are counted in the minyan, and certain tefillot are only led by men. So that's a style of worship that developed on the liberal periphery of modern Orthodoxy about 20 years ago. And a group of members of our shul have met as a partnership minyan over the past decade or more, and they have not been allowed to meet inside our synagogue. So they've met in people's homes, and over the years, that's become very tiresome for them and alienating to them that they are paying membership and devoting a lot of time and money and energy on their synagogue, but they have to have their religious needs met monthly, quarterly, whatever, this sort of in someone's living room, which is really hard to do. And so it came on my desk as the rabbi who was hired a few months after I came here. And there was, I would say, clear factions of people who attended this partnership minyan in the neighborhood and really wanted it to be in their shul building. And there were people who really didn't want it to come into the building because they were worried that it would detract from the Orthodox identity of the congregation, be controversial in the broader Orthodox community, detract from communal unity or whatever it was that that was, I think, an example of absolutely no way to satisfy everyone. The recommendation that I then presented to the board, and ultimately I thought it was the board's decision, not mine, was that we could rent space to this partnership minyan as an independent entity, not as a officially sanctioned, approved minyan of the synagogue, with certain stipulations that I felt would maximize the benefit and have the risks be minimized. And I think that decision, I don't think anyone was fully satisfied. I think some people were varying degrees of disappointed in that recommendation. And I guess it remains to be seen whether it was a wise one or not. The implementation in the coming months will really prove whether or not the recommendations were wise or not, and we'll find out.
I dream of a future where there could be egalitarian, but what's sometimes called partnership minions at Shearith Israel. Right? I could dream of a future also where there is guitar and practice that isn't about fulfilling a chiyuv. Like I would hope to have a community that could hold the boundaries really, really wide, knowing those boundaries, and also like seeing that it's not about a narrow definition of conservative Judaism. It's about a committed, vibrant Jewish life.
But even if boundaries are essential to community because they hold those of us together who abide by them in a framework that we all need, and even though sometimes those boundaries are tested and sometimes they can't hold everyone, I think it's also true that community also relies on tolerating a wide amount of diversity and difference. or at least interesting community does. And I think most structures of community that operate with a liberal framework do. Homogeneity is boring, and anyway, it's not really possible in our milieu that is so defined by individual self-actualization. So the art of stitching together community is to create something slow and collaborative, to involve a community's diverse members in weaving the fabric of something more beautiful because of their collective involvement, and ultimately creating something more resilient and durable as a result. Surviving as individuals in a community characterized by rich diversity can be hard, especially in today's environment that seems to incentivize polarization and echo chambers. To do so, to survive in community, requires a lot of empathy and patience, and a willingness to see the possibility of a return amidst all the noise. For rabbis, engaging in this work on behalf of the community, building something for the benefit of all that requires sacrifice by all, is essential. I'm not sure whether it's a skill or an art. I think it also might require some good luck, or even, at times, divine providence.
What I've tried to do most recently is to reflect back to the congregation that among its core characteristics as a community, one of the things that they're most proud about is their diversity as a congregation, that there are people with really different religious backgrounds who practice Judaism in really different ways, who see the world in really different ways. That's really unusual for a 21st century Orthodox congregation to have this much diversity contained within one congregation. And I reflect that back to them frequently to help them understand that there are going to be people who in this congregation who will make really different religious choices from you, and to rather than be bothered by that or see that as somehow harming one's identity or putting one's identity at risk, but actually, no, I can be proud of the fact that I'm a part of a congregation that encompasses such a broad spectrum of religious expression.
I said to the congregation on Rosh Hashanah, there are congregations where everyone agrees, and if you don't agree with everything, you're really not in the right congregation. And there are congregations where people agree about some things and disagree about other things, but they only talk about the things they agree about. And there are congregations where you love one another enough to actually lean into the parts that are different and maybe hard and learn from one another, because you know that the foundation of the relationship is stronger than the disagreements that challenge it. I hope and I strive that for our community that we're able to achieve a vision of real pluralism one day. And what I tell people is, I say, coming into our sanctuary on Shabbat morning is when you will see the most of us gathered in a place doing a thing at a time regularly. But our sanctuary is not the only place things are happening. Your place on a Shabbat morning might be in the alternative service with a guitar and a very abbreviated Torah reading and lots of singing. Or your place might be in our Torah study, learning and talking and growing in that way at the same time as all the other things are happening. Or your place might be in the lobby, having l'chaim with people, which starts, at such and such time. And all of those I want people to feel are viable ways to feel at homeness, because the person I'm always looking out for is a person who might have come and they don't quite know where their spot is yet.
Our first episode ended on a note of loneliness. Today, we've arrived at some amount of at-homeness. When it all works, both the rabbi and the congregation can see the essential nature of their interdependence. It's a good fit. And it's tempting to think that those two sides of the issue, on the rabbi's side, who they are, what quest they're on, and on the community side, who they are, and how does a rabbi serve them and be served by them in return, that solving on both of those ends is all that defines the work of the rabbi these days. I think a great many rabbis wish that that was it. I know a lot of them seek to be pastors, teachers, good friends, guides, everything that they do, and to do it locally, to care for their people, to plant trees, and to watch them all grow. But that's not really the state of affairs. Atop the local and the communal sit the heaviness of our concerns as a people, which can be better described as national and global. To be a rabbi today is to also feel a sense of the burden of history on your shoulders, carrying Torah and the people through a liminal time, and to feel immense responsibilities to sustain our people in private and in public through the flow of history. Rabbis are the gatekeepers, leaders, and nurturers of our community and our people, and we need them now more than ever. In this moment, as we all turn inward, searching for meaning and guidance, the Jewish people are looking to rabbis for leadership and answers about what our future holds. There are also indicators in this field that the perils facing the work are mounting and making the work harder and harder, even as our need for spiritual support is increasing. Next time on Rabbinic Identities, Rabbinic Crises. Thanks for listening to our show, and special thanks to our rabbis, Ari Kamen, Carrie Brown, David Wolkenfeld, Felicia Saul, Joel Nickerson, and Sarah Basson for sharing their stories. Identity Crisis is produced by Tessa Zitter. Our executive producer is Maytal Friedman. This episode was produced with assistance from Annie Beyer-Chaffetz and edited by Gareth Hobbs at Silver Sound NYC. Transcripts of our show are now available on our website, typically a week after an episode airs. We're always looking for ideas of what we should cover in future episodes. If you have a topic you'd like to hear about, or if you have comments about this episode, please write to us at identitycrisis@shalomhartman.org. For more ideas from the Shalom Hartman Institute about what's unfolding right now, sign up for our newsletter in the show notes and subscribe to this podcast everywhere podcasts are available. We'll see you next week, and thanks for listening.